Hey everybody, today we are talking about chapters 8 through 15 of Prisoner of Azkaban. So, while deciding what to talk to you about today, two roads diverged in the Forbidden Forest, and one was Quidditch, and one was Dementors. So, I'm going to say a few things, just a couple of quick things about Quidditch, and then we're taking the other road. So, thing one, in the school story chapter of Harry Potter and Beyond, Pugh wrote that Harry's Quidditch skills foreshadow his skills in the battle with Voldemort, with the dangers of the game standing in for the dangers of fighting Voldemort. To me, that's a little bit of a stretch, but I do see a metaphor in Quidditch, which is that it's this team sport with everybody playing their part, including protecting the Seeker, but ultimately it's the Seeker, Harry, who must both finish the game and win the game. And that's a pretty close relationship to what happens across the series. So Harry can't do what he does without the help of a ton of other characters, but none of the other characters can be the one to win and finish the game, so to speak. That has to be Harry. Second thing about Quidditch is just kind of a question that I have, and it's a spoiler, so I'm going to word it carefully. Okay, so Harry is naturally good at flying, even in his first lesson when he doesn't have his fancy broom. And it's one of the few magical skills that he's good at with no training at all. Another such skill is Parseltongue. So, my question is Harry a natural at flying for the same reason that he's a natural at Parseltongue? So, something to think about. You can sort of extrapolate from there. Okay, so that's enough Quidditch for now. Let's talk about Dementors and the justice system of the magical world. With the caveat that we're still in Book 3, so there's a lot to come back to later. Okay, so to start with, we know that the application of magical law is inconsistent. We see this first with underage magic laws. Even with just Harry, it's inconsistent. In Book 2, he immediately gets a warning about underage magic after Dobby drops the floating pudding. But in Book 3, when he's sure that he's going to be expelled and possibly arrested, Cornelius Fudge is like, no big deal, Harry. These things happen. And we might assume that's because Fudge is more worried about the Sirius Black situation, but actually later in Book 5, Harry's going to break the underage magic rule again, for good reason, but this time he's in really big trouble, so it isn't consistent. Even the mechanism for detecting underage magic isn't really clear. It seems to be location-based, which would mean that students with magical families have more leeway, because it's assumed that there will be magic happening in those spaces because of the adults. The result of that is that we have disproportionate scrutiny and surveillance of and enforcement against the Muggle-born students, who we know are already marginalized in this society in other ways. We also see inconsistency in who's sent to Azkaban. It's pretty clear by this point in the series that Lucius Malfoy was a willing and enthusiastic Death Eater. But when baby Harry stopped Voldemort and the Ministry rounded up the Death Eaters, the Malfoys claimed that they'd been under the Imperius Curse and they hadn't meant to do anything that they'd done. And the implication is that they used their power and their privilege to avoid punishment, while less privileged Death Eaters went to Azkaban. In contrast, in Book 2, Fudge sends Hagrid to Azkaban as a precaution, or really as a show that Fudge is doing something, and Hagrid's not been convicted of anything, either in the present or 50 years ago, but that earlier event with the Chamber of Secrets 50 years ago makes him suspicious enough that he can be easily scapegoated, a second time, even over Dumbledore's objections. And that is certainly related to who Hagrid is. As a half-giant, he's assumed to be dangerous and not quite human. And as a person who didn't finish his wizarding education and seems to come from a working-class background, Hagrid may seem disposable to someone like Fudge. So remember that Fudge told Hagrid, oh, you only need to be locked up in Azkaban until we catch the real culprit. And that turned out to be 2 months, but actually there was no guarantee that the culprit would ever be found. They didn't catch him last time. So this could have been a life sentence for Hagrid without any sort of trial. And now that Hagrid's been at Azkaban, we can assume that there's even more of a cloud of suspicion around him. At this point, he has the Ministry's full apology, and he's even now on drinking terms with Fudge. But in addition to his own trauma and fear of being sent back, people are always going to suspect Hagrid. If we think back to Book 2, Lockhart said to Harry, quote, "The Minister of Magic wouldn't have taken Hagrid if he hadn't been 100% sure that he was guilty." I think that's probably why Dumbledore gives Hagrid the teaching position in Book 3, to signal his confidence in Hagrid. But people are always going to wonder, and Hagrid's always going to feel insecure about how people view him. And I think we can assume that these instances of inconsistency in the magical justice system aren't anomalies. More likely, just like in our world, people with privilege often escape consequences, while we have marginalized populations being much more likely to be surveilled, prosecuted, and incarcerated. And this creates a presumption of criminality around some populations, which I think we can see a lot across this series. And going forward into the later books, we can think about ways in which the Ministry may be using this as a tool to scare and suppress some parts of magical society. So going back to Azkaban, I want to think about how, so in some ways, Azkaban fits with the pre-industrial revolution aesthetic and economy of the magical world. If we think about prisons as having multiple functions, with the priorities of those functions shifting over time, Azkaban fits solidly into a historical period in which prison was for punishment and for keeping criminals away from the public, as compared to a more recent shift to include some efforts, at least, at rehabilitation. Though I would add that Azkaban also anticipates places like the detention camp at Guantanamo, which the US government established 3 years after the book was published. But if we think about function, we can see that Azkaban is essentially a life sentence. Aside from Hagrid, we don't see prisoners being released, and that's in keeping with what we would expect, given that the Dementors cause prisoners to go insane within a few months. They're not intending to release them. So that also means that rehabilitation is not one of the functions of this prison. For me, this raises the question of why they don't simply kill the prisoners. If they're considered extremely dangerous, the Ministry is not planning on releasing them, and imprisonment at Azkaban is considered a fate worse than death. And my rather dark answer to this is that the fate worse than death thing is a feature, not a bug. Death would be too easy and not scary enough or satisfying enough for the public. So instead, these prisoners endure torture at Azkaban, specifically a combination of prolonged solitary confinement and extreme psychological torture that is not just sanctioned by the government, but built into the system itself. We know that Dementors feed on the souls and energies of humans, and since they're magical creatures, I think we have to acknowledge that feed isn't a metaphor here. When they're described as starving or unable to resist, I don't think that's meant to be hyperbole. This is what they literally need to survive. If you strip away the scary trappings, Dementors are basically an animal predator that must eat to survive. It's in the hands of the Ministry that this predictable action becomes a tool. And we can talk in class about what Dementors might be doing if they didn't have this ready food supply of prisoner souls, and whether the Ministry is striking some sort of ethical bargain, and whether that's acceptable or not. But for now, I just want to highlight that this is not a case of the Ministry being good guys who reluctantly use dark magic. The Ministry set up this system, and it's working as they designed. The other intended function of prisons, and strict punishments in general, is deterrence. And if we look at someone like Hagrid, he's definitely scarred by Azkaban, and he's terrified of going back. And maybe this makes him more law-abiding in the rest of the series. But in the real world, criminology research shows that it's the certainty of being caught, rather than the harshness of the punishment, that's effective in deterring people from crime. Which suggests that you don't need a horror show like Azkaban. You need consistent application of the law to people like the Malfoys. So, finally, I want to talk more about the Dementors. So while I think we can read them as magical creatures who simply act on animal instincts, we also have to consider their depiction in these stories as magical law enforcement. They're primarily prison guards, and it's clear why they're well suited to that role, given the function of punishment that the magical world seems to have for Azkaban. But in this book, they're also being deployed as guards around Hogwarts and as a sort of search and capture force for Sirius Black, both of which raise some interesting questions. In my Potter Watch video with Deb Noel, which discusses some of these same topics, I mentioned that the book was published just after the Columbine shooting and before we saw American schools employing in-school police officers en masse. But in reading this book, that's what I'm reminded of. And like these school police officers, these Hogwarts Dementors seem to be surveilling students, contributing to an atmosphere of fear and anxiety, and causing trouble for vulnerable and traumatized students in particular, all without a lot of evidence that they're preventing the violence that they're there to prevent. Similarly, in their role as the Sirius Black recapture squad, it's not clear to me that the Dementors are particularly well suited to this job. The text gives us no evidence of any specialized skills or attributes that they might have for finding escaped prisoners. They don't have any kind of magical prisoner GPS. And while Dumbledore tells the students that Dementors aren't fooled by disguises or invisibility cloaks, clearly Sirius Black has managed to find a way to fool them because he's escaped Azkaban. What the Dementors do have is the license and instinct to use the equivalent of lethal force on Sirius Black if they do manage to find him. They're also permitted to board the Hogwarts Express and patrol the streets of Hogsmeade, harassing random students and citizens without any kind of oversight and creating a terrifying spectacle. And that spectacle is the point, I think. We already know that Fudge is a politician who wants to be seen as doing something. He'll send Hagrid to Azkaban even though he knows Hagrid is innocent just to make it look like he's doing something. So the Dementors may not be the most effective way to find Sirius Black, but they're certainly the showiest. And they create fear, which is useful. The order from the Ministry of Magic in Hogsmeade advises customers to finish shopping and go home before sundown, not because Sirius Black is on the loose, but because the Dementors will be patrolling. Fudge wants to station the Dementors at Hogwarts itself, not just on the perimeter, but Dumbledore refuses. And that's part of the ongoing power struggle between Fudge and Dumbledore, but Dumbledore's objection is also legitimate. The Dementors almost kill Harry at the Quidditch match, and he's clearly more afraid of them than he is of Sirius Black. So as a white person with white children, I've never given or received the talk that parents of Black and Latino and Indigenous children give them about how to survive encounters with police officers in America. But I recognize its echoes in Dumbledore's opening speech. He says of the Dementors, "I therefore warn each and every one of you to give them no reason to harm you." I think the parallel continues in that the children are seeing here for the first time in the series that this is something outside of Dumbledore's control. He can't protect them from the Dementors. All he can do is warn the students not to give the Dementors any reason to harm them. And of course we see that doesn't work. The narrative rejects the argument that if you're not doing anything wrong, you have nothing to worry about from the law and its enforcers. The students on the train or at the Quidditch match, they're minding their own business, not giving the Dementors any reason to harm them, and they still experience, at a minimum, psychological harm from the Dementors. This book, it predates the post-9/11 increase in policing in all public spaces and the specific targeting of Muslim and Middle Eastern people. But it's contemporaneous with the rise of stop-and-frisk policies, targeting especially Black and Latino men and boys in the US, and it's contemporaneous with increased CCTV surveillance in the UK. So I read the text as engaging with those and other historical moments and influences, again on this level of metaphor, and having a lot to say about policing, prisons, and justice in our real world. And rereading the series now, in the midst of a national conversation about police and police violence and racism and white supremacy, and related discussions about prisons and ICE and migrant detention centers, I think these books give us a lot to discuss. So I'm really looking forward to hearing your thoughts about it in class.